My name, for those of you who don't know me, is David Bush. I am the candidate of record for Saanich Gulf Islands. I stood for the Conservative Party in the last two elections. By way of background, I think the most important thing is I've got two young boys that they're currently home, and hopefully the nanny will tuck them in just fine. But I've got a degree in biochemistry, a second degree in nursing. I worked a number of years as a critical care nurse, and then went back and got a law degree, and I've been working quite happily as a lawyer ever since, notwithstanding when I'm out running around and playing politics. And what I love most about politics is this, the civil exchange of ideas. Not yelling, the screaming back and forth like you see in question period. And quite frankly, if my kids behaved like that, I'd want to take them out back and give them a little shake, but that would not be a good thing to do. But in any event, so that's my background, biochemistry, nursing, and the law. And what got me pushed into politics was the simple fact that people don't talk about religion, they don't talk about politics. And consequently, as we've learned, or rather we've forgotten how to do that. And I think events like this are important so that we can all once again start to learning about how to talk civilly about differences of ideas and realize it's not about, they're the enemy or they're the opponent. It's about trying to understand the other person's point of view. And just because you can't defend your point of view doesn't mean you're wrong, but it certainly means you need to go and do some more research.
Thank you. David Murner.
I'd also like to say thank you to Jeremy and Jonathan and all the people who put this together. It takes a lot to put together the lights, the microphones, as you saw earlier, and the concept is really great. David and I come from different political backgrounds, but we know each other professionally. I'm a retired lawyer now, and we came to know each other through our profession. And we have lunch from time to time. We argue with each other, but we also laugh. And I hope tonight will be about a constructive conversation about the carbon tax. As you might be able to guess, I'm a fan of the carbon tax. I'm really proud of British Columbia having done so well in bringing in the carbon tax in 2008, and not only bringing it in and cutting income tax by $500 million when it did that, but also creating a province which had really the most dynamic economy in Canada between 2008 and 2018. And so I think there's a lot to be said about the carbon tax. I know David disagrees with some of this, and this is the start of that conversation. And I really appreciate everybody coming out. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think to start the debate, it's always like every policy exists to solve a problem or to improve the world in some way, right? So in order to really join issue and know what we're debating, it would be good to hear from both of you. What is the problem that the carbon tax is solving? I'll start with you, David.
I'm assuming everybody in this room, and this might be the wrong assumption, has heard about global warming, and also the fact that global warming is largely due to human consumption of fossil fuels and the release of greenhouse gases, especially CO2 and methane. And so that is really a key problem for us internationally. We've signed all sorts of agreements, the Paris Accords most recently. It's a major problem in terms of future generations. Where are we going to go if we aren't able to reduce our carbon emissions? And so the carbon tax is one way of reducing carbon emissions. That's why we have a carbon tax. And there are other ways of addressing it. I'm sure we'll deal with those as well. But in my view, it's a really important tool to addressing a critical issue facing Canadians now, especially in northern Canada where the permafrost is melting, and future generations of Canadians as well.
Thank you. David Bush, what are your thoughts on what the carbon tax is supposed to be doing?
Other than taking money out of our pockets, I'm not really sure what it's doing. We can talk about climate change, we can talk about global warming, but really that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. We're here to talk about the carbon tax and what is its purpose. And I sort of looked at it like, we can make the attack that way, but the target audience that I want to speak to tonight are the ones like David who support the carbon tax. And we're going to need more than an hour if we're going to try to go down the lines and argue it through a global warming or climate change model. My focus is on the fact that it doesn't work, unless of course you're trying to make people very, very poor, in which case it's an astounding success. There are many, many better ways to get to that goal. And so I'm going to not be arguing from a climate change perspective, and I'm sorry if people wanted to hear that tonight. My focus is to those who support the carbon tax and make them see that if that's what they want to be going at, and the purpose is to lower carbon emissions, there are many better ways that can make us not only not suffer, but can actually make Canada much more prosperous, so we can all have a better quality of life while apparently achieving the goal that Trudeau says he's after, which is to lower CO2 emissions, but appears to be failing miserably at the end of the day.
That's one of the things we actually agree on. David and I agree on the Trudeau government's carbon tax and its failure. The design of it is very poor. The idea of giving rebates, even though 80% of Canadians benefit from the rebates more than they actually pay in taxes, I still think the idea of paying back these rebates is a very bureaucratic way of handling things. I like the way the BC government did it, which is to cut everybody's income tax. Like I said earlier, $500 million in income tax cuts, I see as a much better way of handling it than what Trudeau did.
The rebates are really interesting because they like to toss out that number, 80% of Canadians. Well, that's not what the PBO said. At least that might have been what the PBO said back in 2019, and the Liberals all liked it. But now it's less than 60. And by next year, it's going to be down to 40. And it's going down, down, down. Why? Because the carbon tax is going up, but it's not the rebates only on the part that you pay. The rebate doesn't count the fact that the farmer who's burning natural gas to dry his grain. It doesn't count the carbon tax that's being paid by the greenhouse operator to increase CO2 in the greenhouses so that his plants grow better. It doesn't count the fuel that takes those tomatoes from that greenhouse to the packaging plant, or from the packaging plant to the grocery store. It doesn't count any of that, and it certainly doesn't count the GST that Trudeau charges on top of that. And that's why people are getting poorer and poorer with the carbon tax. And he can say, oh yeah, 80% get back, but there's lies, damn lies in statistics. And then there's what a lot of the politicians are saying right now when they're saying that 80% number. They're cherry picking a small piece and ignoring the rest of it. Make no mistake, the PBO said that by 2028, 90% of Canadians are going to be poor because of the carbon tax, even with the rebates.
So, just to again continue setting the parameters. Obviously, the purpose here is to create an incentive to burn less carbon. And there's multiple inputs, as you said, where it might affect people. Is it fair to say that this will reduce emissions in some way? Is it fair to say that it will actually disincentivize people from using carbon and maybe think of alternatives?
You're assuming you have an alternative. Now, this is one spot where David and I will agree. And the economists say that the best means would be a carbon tax if, and only if, it is uniform around the world. Because if one jurisdiction has a carbon tax and another one doesn't, what happens is the business investment just goes to that area where it's cheaper. Pierre was talking, and by Pierre I mean the Conservative Party leader, was talking with a tomato farmer in the Ottawa region who was saying his tomatoes are more expensive than tomatoes that are being shipped up from Mexico, despite the fact of all the diesel that's going to be burned bringing them up. Why? Because he has to pay a carbon tax on with regards to his greenhouses and all the way down that line. I don't think that's what they wanted, was simply to send investment elsewhere. But that's the effect that happens when you don't have a uniform carbon tax on every jurisdiction. And no, I'm not saying we should have a uniform world government, but the problem is unless every government brings one in, at the end of the day, the only effect it's going to do is shift where the manufacturing, where the development is being done.
This is one of the points that we agree on. The idea that you need to have a level playing field is really critical. And one of the ideas that's being negotiated right now internationally is to say Canada should be charging at the border for countries like China and India, which are really carbon-intensive countries, who are importing their goods to us. And they're getting an unfair advantage because we're charging a carbon tax. They shouldn't be getting an unfair advantage, and we agree on that. One of the reasons BC decided that
we don't agree that we should put in an import tax, but otherwise we agree.
We agree on the level playing field. But the other thing, the reason BC went into this carbon tax in 2008 and has had such a success in BC is because we were very concerned that the California government was going to impose import taxes on goods from British Columbia. So Quebec, Ontario, BC were all very concerned about what California could do in their legislature to stop us from bringing our products there. So I think the sense that there should be a level playing field is a good idea. The fact that California could have punished us for not having a carbon tax was a real driver for us in BC to make sure that at least we were taxing carbon here in British Columbia and not having the Americans tax it and get the tax revenues in California. So that's one of the drivers for, it's not just emissions reduction, because that was part of the question, is what's driving this. Partly emissions reduction, but partly we don't want the Americans to be taxing our products going in there, right? We want to make sure we're getting the tax revenues here, and that way we can cut income taxes, right? Like we do in BC.
Well, I'm glad to hear it's only partially for CO2 emissions, because every year since BC's brought in a carbon tax, our emissions have gone up, with two exceptions, the 2008 recession and the COVID recession. Otherwise, every year emissions have been climbing.
That's true, but do you mind if I just jump in really briefly? Yeah. It's true, but our carbon emissions have gone up a lot more slowly than the rest of Canada, where they don't have carbon taxes, right? So what we're trying to do is compare apples to apples, and when we brought in the carbon tax in BC, our carbon emission increases were way lower than the rest of Canada, and they have been ever since we brought in the carbon tax. And there's some argument over this, and it's not a politician saying this, it's the Environment Commissioner of Canada saying that about 30% of Canada's carbon emission reductions are related to the carbon tax. So one of the questions we have to discuss, and I think it's coming later, is if we end carbon taxes, what are we going to do to bring down our carbon emissions? What other options are there? And I think there's some agreement between David and I on some of those options as well.
You have to show me that study because I haven't seen it, but I'll take your word for it.
So I think one thing that we can agree on, just as a fact, a function of our population and our place in the world, is that we're a pretty tiny portion of global emissions, maybe 1% or so, and maybe BC is a tenth of Canada, maybe a tenth of 1%, right? In view of India, China are increasing emissions faster than we could ever reduce them, does Canadian tax policy even make a difference to climate at all? Like, how does it, if so? And what's the basis for putting ourselves on maybe a less level playing field for a negligible reduction?
Yeah, that's a really key question, because when we knock on the doorsteps, we hear people saying, well, China, India, Canada shouldn't have to do it. We have a relatively small proportion. I think it's 1.5% of world carbon emissions. So why would we kill ourselves, right, to deal with that? But the other side of the coin is that Canada is one of the worst polluters in the world. Like, we're in the top 2 of the world. The US beats us here in per capita carbon emissions. And we can do better than that. The other thing that's a real problem is that we're in the top 10. We're a small country, but we're in the top 10 of total carbon emissions in the world. So we have, I think, some responsibility. And we've been polluting like this for a long time. China has been polluting very seriously over the past 10, 15, 20 years as their economy grew. But we have, I think, a real responsibility to be a leader in this. And we are, as I said earlier. British Columbia has been a leader in it. Quebec is also a leader. They have a different system. They have what's called a cap and trade system, which also sets a market price for carbon and is, at the cutting edge of how to reduce carbon emissions. The European Union does the same thing. So there's different ways of doing it, but Canada, I think, has a moral responsibility because we're one of the worst polluters, second worst in the world per capita. Each one of us as Canadians is responsible for that.
That being said, I like my heat in the winter and I don't want to freeze to death. And India, on the other hand, has a climate where you're not going to freeze to death. And they're turning around and building 75% of their energy comes from coal burning. And they're building a new coal plant about every 8 days. China's doing better on that, though, building 2 new coal plants every week. And if this was really about trying to save the world and lowering CO2 emissions, well, there's a great business case, even though our prime minister says there isn't, for selling natural gas. We had Germany coming here. We had Japan coming here. Someone else just came the other day, and I can't remember. Greece just came, again, looking for natural gas. And if you go back to the Paris Accord, they actually look at this. and say, look, if you can turn around and help another country decrease their CO2 emissions, you can get credit for that. Well, we could turn around and help India, for example, change all of its coal plants to natural gas. And we would decrease the CO2 emissions by 70% per plant. Well, if we could do that to all of India's coal plants, that would be the equivalent of taking 4 times Canada's CO2 emissions out of the atmosphere for the world. Now, last time I checked, the wind patterns blow all around the world and they don't stay just in Canada. So if this was really about trying to lower CO2 emissions, well, selling our natural gas, A, will greatly decrease CO2 emissions, and B, put money into our pockets so that we don't have to pay as much in tax and our kids can have a better quality of life. However, our government sent them packing saying there is no business case, and Germany was sitting there going, we'll pay for it, we'll pay for the port, we'll pay for everything, but if you don't want it, we'll go invest in Qatar. So they're selling natural gas now to Germany. Meanwhile, Germany's still raising ground to get at the coal that they have because they are desperate for energy, and they're a developed country.
David and I actually agree on CO2 emissions. The problem is methane. Methane is 80 times more toxic in terms of greenhouse gases and its ability to capture heat. And natural gas emits huge amounts of methane. The whole pipeline process, the drilling process, the refining process is extremely problematic. And the problem with saying we can export our natural gas is the international regulators aren't going to give us any credit for that. They're going to say methane is almost as bad as coal in terms of the impact on global warming. And so exporting our natural gas is actually creating a huge methane problem in Canada, which has a huge impact, an immediate impact, much more serious impact than CO2.
Well, tell that to Norway because that's part of how they're getting to zero and the world is accepting it. But also, more to the point, and this is a simple fact, and Andrew Weaver's written a number of papers on this as well, how coal is the #1 enemy. And the simple fact is natural gas, instead of coal, is 70% fewer emissions, full stop, that's the end of it. So if we were actually really concerned about the environment and wanted to be seen as environmental stewards, we should be pushing that instead of standing up on a soapbox and virtue signaling saying, look at us, we've sacrificed our economy, our quality of life, and our children's future. You guys should be just like us.
So this policy of a carbon tax has been proposed for a while. As David mentioned, it came about in BC in 2008. And right around the same time, in 2008, it was proposed federally by the Liberal Party. It was Stéphane Dion was the leader of the Liberal Party then, and he branded it the Green Shift. And the Liberals lost that election very badly. Some people might remember they were eliminated to very, very low, and basically it was an embarrassing defeat for them. People then said, oh, well, this isn't viable anymore. I think the Liberals kind of backpedaled on it for a while. I know that both of you are knowledgeable in Canadian recent political history. If it wasn't viable then, what made it viable after Trudeau came to power? How, and I'll throw this to David first, why is this now considered to be something that is a winner?
David and I love this question, and we both want to jump in on it, because it's true that Dion lost. But, as we said earlier, the Liberals here in BC learned from the idea of a tax shift, and they said, we can make this work politically, and they did. They brought in a carbon tax, the NDP opposed it, and they won a large majority after bringing it in. And why is that? Because they said, we guarantee this will be revenue neutral. So this isn't a tax grab. We're going to make sure that every dollar we bring in off the carbon tax is going to result in a reduction in the income tax. And they even put in an officer to make sure they were accountable for that. And they calculated them, and as I said earlier, it was basically a $500 million tax cut for income tax. It was an increase on the carbon tax, but it also reduced the income tax. That was the model that was very successful. you go back to the last federal election when the Conservatives campaigned on the carbon tax. They were looking at better models than the Trudeau model, and it's not that hard to find them. They were saying it's the most efficient way of taxing. It's why the CEO of Suncor, the CEO of Husky Oil, it's why the American Petroleum Institute is behind the carbon tax. These are not people who really want to cut their businesses and ruin their own business success. But they can see that we need to do something about carbon emissions. And the government of Alberta itself, people don't talk about this, have a carbon tax as well. It's called REIT. It's an industrial carbon tax. They just raised it $15 per ton in April, same as the federal carbon tax. Nobody's talking about it because it's actually a very smart way of reducing carbon emissions without creating huge bureaucracies. And so I think politically, if you do it right, like if it's hidden, like the REIT in Alberta, it has much less political political cost, and you can survive as a politician. There's the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to you. We live in a different time now as well from 2008 and Stéphane Dion's campaign. We live in a time of social media. We live in a time of very nasty polarization. And we live in a time where slogans like axe the tax and spike the hike really work with a lot of Canadians who don't study these questions, right? We're in a populist environment where it doesn't really matter what the economists say, the Nobel Prize winner
let's talk about what the economists actually said.
It matters what Pierre Poilievre says when he says axe the tax. People listen to that more than the economists. Over to you.
Again, the economist said it's the most efficient way if everybody is doing it. So you can't just cherry pick the one, well, I guess you can cherry pick the one half if you want, but if you're going to be honest with people, it's the most efficient if everybody is doing it. And on that part, we agree, but you have to give the entire quote. Now, why is everybody raising their carbon tax this year? Well, because Trudeau said you have to, or he's going to come and clubber you with it. Cost of living, be damned, he knows best. But it's not making a difference in the world. And that's the bigger problem. Now, you roll it back to 2007, there was a lot of things at play. The Liberals, very different Liberal Party. They'd been coming off years of Liberals running the country. And, well, Dion certainly wasn't Jean Chrétien, that's for sure. You'll remember Stephen Harper had a minority government on that first round. And he won his majority because he showed that he could have stable, effective government. Dion's green shift, don't want to use the other term that people had for it at the time, his green shift was but one piece in that plank. Same with out here in BC with the Liberals. There's very few voters that are completely one-issue voters, and this is the only issue they care about. They care about a number of them, not the least of which is, hey, can I afford food on the table? And wait a minute, this gives me a chance to maybe avoid that tax and save some money, and that's great if you can avoid it. Checked on the bus schedule to come down here, and it was going to take me an hour to get here by bus. I can jog it in less time. That's a problem. Okay, I race triathlons, I've done a couple Ironmans. I like biking, I like running. But I'm not about to bike to work in the rain, or if I need to wear a suit because you get the chain grease on the suit and it's really hard to come out. And usually I'm carrying a lot of boxes. It doesn't work. So if you don't have an option, if you don't have another choice, this isn't a tax you can avoid. But most of all, like all taxes, they go up. Where's that ombudsman now? How long has it been since BC's tax has been revenue neutral? I can't remember, it's been quite a while. And that's the problem, or at least another problem, is it rapidly turns into just another revenue generating scheme, and you can't avoid it anymore. And how are you supposed to get to work to be able to generate income if you can't put the gas in the car and the public transportation doesn't work? Now, this is a spot me and Dave agree upon. We need to get more doing with public transportation. But that's how we're going to solve this problem. You can't tax your way out of it. All you're doing is making people too poor and too desperate.
So, in recent development, we have the leader of the NDP federally, Jagmeet Singh, saying similar sentiments to what you just said, David, that he would prefer not to punish people who can't change how they heat their homes or get to work. He said, we don't want working people to feel like they're shouldering the burden. And I'll throw this question to both of you. Does this signify a change in another change? The green shift has apparently happened in BC and now federally. Now the NDP is backing away from it. Does this signify, is this becoming less politically possible or palatable to the people when even the NDP, a left of center party that has talked a lot about environmental sustainability, that they are backing away their support from it? How do you see that just practically, politically?
I'll believe it as soon as they stop supporting the Trudeau government. I think more to the point, like everyone else, they see the polls. Like everyone else, they can do some research. And it took them a little bit longer, but like the people who go to the grocery store and they're seeing the changes in the price, they're seeing the problems. Well, it wasn't until the NDP's poll, they had to finally accept the fact that their polling numbers are in the basement. Trudeau's numbers are in the basement. And they're now start looking, going, well, wait a minute, we might not be able to keep our jobs, and we might not be able to afford to keep putting food on our tables if we don't start doing a better job. That being said, I'll believe it when I see it.
The NDP haven't actually been carbon tax supporters historically in British Columbia. They opposed the Campbell carbon tax when it came in 2008. They voted against it. They campaigned against it in the next election, lost a lot of votes. A lot of people said, we have to do something about carbon emissions. We have to do something for future generations. And they ended up voting Liberal, even though they might have been friendly to the NDP on social issues. They just felt that the NDP were not reliable on environmental issues. And you look at the NDP federal record, you know, their agreement with the Liberals has zero in it about the environment. They talk about dental care, which is very good, and pharmacare, which is great, but they don't talk at all about environmental issues. And there's a problem. The NDP have never really been very committed to deep environmental action. You look at the mowing down of the old growth forests and so on. We're getting slightly off topic with that. But what I would say is that if you are serious about carbon emissions, you need to identify how are you going to cut them. And it's very simple. If you increase the price of something, demand goes down. It's a basic law of economics. It's why 400 Canadian economists signed a document earlier this year saying the carbon tax is the best way of taxing. They didn't say anything about everybody has to do it. They're saying Canada should just do it because it's the right thing. It's much more effective than cap and trade because you don't have a bureaucracy. And it's much more immediate because increase the price. People will, instead of buying a Ford F-150, they'll buy a smaller non-gas guzzling car. And it doesn't have to be an electric vehicle. It could just be a Ford Taurus, right? You'll still save money. So that's the idea behind, I think, what the NDP are worried about is, oh, we're going to lose votes because Pierre Poilievre is doing a good populist job at distracting people from the real issues. The reason prices are going up is not because of the carbon tax. The Bank of Canada came out with a report just last year saying 0.15% of the inflation increase is due to the carbon tax. It's a tiny proportion of the total amount of inflation, which at that time was about 3.8%. So when Pierre Poilievre is going around saying, oh yeah, it's a tax on everything, you're increasing our prices hugely as part of driving inflation, it's just not true. The Bank of Canada says it's not true. It's less than 0.2%, 0.15% of the inflation. So there's a lot of political exaggeration and rhetoric around this stuff, as opposed to looking at the facts. What do the Bank of Canada, the Environment Commissioner, the 400 academic economists, the Nobel Prize winner for economics in 2018, who said the carbon tax is the way to go?
Bank of Canada's governor appointed by, yeah, we'll come back to that later. But one thing he said that is quite correct. How will the carbon tax decrease carbon emissions? By making something unaffordable. And if you have alternatives, like I said before, that's great. But now here in BC, especially in Victoria, we're lucky. It doesn't get to minus 40 in the winter. I grew up in Northern Ontario. It gets to minus 40 in the winter. Home heating is not something you can afford not to have. You don't have a choice. You can't avoid it. last month, or not last month, but a couple months ago, Alberta, the electric grid almost failed. If you'd only heating your home with electricity, or better yet, forget about Alberta, let's talk about Ottawa back when I was in Ontario in the late 90s. They had that massive ice storm. Power lines went down everywhere, and people literally froze to death because they couldn't get heat. That's the problem. We need to make sure, amongst other things, we have an affordable power grid, and that includes multiple options going forwards. And how does the carbon tax work? Well, if the gasoline gets too expensive, no one can afford to put it in their car, they're not going to buy any. That's true. But they're not going to buy anything because they won't have a job anymore either.
So the next question, I mean, obviously we've touched now on affordability, which is a paramount issue and will be a paramount issue in the next federal election, undoubtedly. I'll start with you, David, on this one. From a practical political perspective, I know you say that the carbon tax is a relatively small piece of inflation or inflationary pressure, but there is this idea that it's contributing a lot. And people are seeing it on their heating bill. They are seeing it. It's a very visible piece, even if it's a small piece. Is this going to be a wedge issue? Is this going to drive people away from parties that are that have an environmentally sustainable brand? Are they going to just say this is too expensive and recoil from those policies now?
Yes, I think in modern politics now, the facts don't really matter. What really matters is identity. Do you identify with a certain party or not? Do you identify with a certain way of thinking? And so what we do is we frame things in our minds as, oh, well, that's a Green Party idea or that's a conservative idea. And unfortunately, we're in this place where, unlike tonight, where we're having a discussion on it and can actually exchange views, in modern politics, it's all about framing and language. The simpler language, the better. Axe the tax is great because it's 3 words, very simple. It doesn't take a genius to figure it out. And it's very appealing at a populist level. But if you're actually looking behind the populist rhetoric of the politicians, if you're looking at what the people who spent their lifetime studying these things, you see, oh, it's more complicated than that. And so yes, cost of living is a key issue. It's going to be probably the #1 issue in the next election. But saying that the carbon tax is creating the problem is so completely unrealistic when you look at things like the supply chain problems we've had since COVID, right? Much deeper problem. The wars we're having right now, especially Ukraine, created a huge problem in the agriculture sector, really drove up agricultural prices, much, much bigger impact than the carbon price in Canada, which is relatively small compared to these huge disruptions, Ukraine, supply chain. Now we have Gaza and Israel, who knows what's going to happen in the Middle East. The other thing is, a critical thing is, huge windfall profits for the fossil fuel industry. They've been making huge amounts of money over the last 10 years. And so those factors are way more important than the carbon price. Just ask any economist, they'll tell you this. But of course, in Canadian politics, we don't talk about it. We just want to axe the tax because that's the easy thing to do. It's the easy political rhetoric. And if you want to listen to politicians like that, that's great. Vote for them. You'll get a government that is playing off the population just like Donald Trump south of the border.
I've got a little more faith in the Canadian voter than my friend, but I do agree partially with what he's saying on this. At the end of the day right now, the economy is going to be the #1 issue at the ballot box. And the Liberals have done such a spectacular job of wiping out our economy, and that's getting people to go, wait a second, no, you guys can't keep running this country because you're running it into the ground. And that very piece, the fact that people are switching from the NDP, who are propping up the Liberals, and the Liberals to the Conservative Party for support, shows that we're not completely locked into that tribal mentality. And that gives me a lot of hope, because they're saying, we gave you a chance, you botched it, we're going to give the other guy a chance now because, well, you're just going to give us more of the same. So I do have a lot of hope going forwards. And the carbon tax is a big chunk of this because it hits all the way through and it's a very visible chunk. But at the end of the day, it is one piece, as my friend said, of a larger problem, not least of which, again, is housing. You look at what's happening, housing prices since Trudeau's come into power have doubled. And that is a bigger problem, but that's a reflection of the issues on the whole, everything from immigration to their massive deficit spending, running up inflation to, there's massive issues on this. But at the end of the day, if you can't afford a roof over your head and food on the table, tomorrow's not going to come. You've got to make sure you can live till tomorrow to start before you start worrying about tomorrow.
And we agree on that. I mean, I think the cost of living is going to be a critical issue. The cost of housing, as you say, is going to be a critical issue in the next federal election. But the question tonight is, how much of the carbon tax responsible for that? And ask any economist, look at the data. It's a tiny proportion of it. So why are the politicians focusing on it? What's in their interest? They see it as a wedge issue. It's a way of wedging people away from what is really a much more complicated question, and one that's not actually entirely in the hands of Canadian politicians. We don't have a huge impact on the Ukraine war. We don't have a huge impact on world supply chain problems. But it's nice to be able to blame something simple like the carbon tax and say, let's axe the tax, which isn't going to solve the problem.
One thing I think we do see in the polls and in at least in years past is that the environment is increasing as a priority for a lot of voters, and people are really thinking about like in Canada, we care about our forests, we care about our oceans, and I think that's something that that's a sentiment that exists across the political spectrum. And I'm going to start with David on this one. What about like a party that just talks about affordability, just talks about economics, like the Conservative Party really emphasizes? How does a party like the Conservatives speak to the really environmentally conscious voter who might consider voting green, or who might, like that really is a priority for them?
I'm hearing in your question that the Conservative Party doesn't care about the environment, and I'd have to say that nothing would be further from the truth. We're the party that got the Acid Rain Accord done. We're the party that had the Prime Minister voted by Greenpeace as the greenest Prime Minister Canada's ever had. We're the party that brought in the national parks. Conservation is in our name. It is what we do. And yeah, we're against the carbon tax, but we're the ones that can get the problems solved. We're the ones that can fix them. Even my friend mentioned that we had a great environmental climate plan last time. Didn't have a carbon tax in it.
In 2019?
In 2019.
We did, yeah. O'Toole campaigned on the
Yeah,
carbon
but
tax.
nobody wanted to talk about it. At least not about the Conservative plan. And I knocked on a number of doors like, oh, you don't have an environmental plan. I'm like, yeah, we do. Here it is. And they're like, this is great. Why haven't I heard about it? Because the media didn't want to talk about it for us. Nobody wanted to bring it out. It was always, oh, you guys don't have a plan. And that partisan politics is part of the problem. We need to get out and talk to more people. I had one individual say, like, I've never spoken to a Conservative that sounded like you. And I said, well, how many Conservatives have you spoken to? None. Well, of course you don't know what we stand for then. But again, we have the plan, not least of which is we're looking, though, at the big picture. We're looking at the worldwide picture. Whether or not Canada makes its emissions targets, we want to get there. And we want to lower our emissions, but do it in a way that's not going to bankrupt the country and put everybody into living in tents. We've got too many people living in tents as it is. But let's start, as I said, with India. Let's start with Germany, Japan, Greece, who've come to us and say, help us lower our emissions, and at the same time, help the world. And hey, we'll pay for it, so everybody gets to win. And you look at what Norway's done. They've taken their oil revenues and they've thrown it into the largest sovereign trust fund in the world. And there's a reason why Norway has 2 cars in every driveway. One's gas, one's electric, because they have massive subsidies paid for from those oil royalties so that they're almost giving away the electric cars. And if you're just going down the street to the grocery store, you hop in the electric car. If you're taking a longer trip or it's really cold and it's a blizzard, maybe you take the gas car. But it's done responsibly, thinking long term, not just, as I said, virtue signaling, look at us, look at what we've managed to do.
So I actually agree that there have been real conservative heroes on environmental issues. Mulroney's one with the Acid Rain Treaty and with Ronald Reagan, another conservative, right? Margaret Thatcher got it as well. Boris Johnson now was in a debate this week. A lot of the conservatives get it, but Pierre Poilievre doesn't. The idea that you can axe the tax and that'll solve your cost of living problem is completely unrealistic. The idea that you can axe the tax and figure out how to address carbon emissions, the 30% of all carbon emission reductions that depend on the carbon tax, is going to be a very interesting problem for him to solve before the next election. One of the things I encourage voters to do is, yes, in 2019, the Conservatives actually had a carbon tax in their platform, and it was a platform that made sense. It'll be very interesting to see in 2025 next year what's in that platform. And if they're not going to have a carbon tax, if they're going to lose 30% of the carbon emissions reductions from that Canada can claim, then where are they going to make up that 30%? Where are they going to find it? And that's one of the things that Conservatives are going to have to answer.
Let's talk about leaders and their environmental record for a second. Not so distant election, I was up against Elizabeth May, and we were championing the Energy East pipeline. And one of the big advantages of the Energy East pipeline would be to take oil to the East Coast. And you may or may not be aware, but all the oil burned from Ontario East is shipped in or comes up from the States, but a lot of it comes down the St. Lawrence. And those oil tankers are, amongst other things, running into the right whale population, which is going extinct due to, well, a lot of deaths because whales versus ships don't end well for the whale. Not only that, where you have oil tankers, someday there may well be a spill. Well, Elizabeth May didn't like the Energy East pipeline, a pipeline that would have kept money in Canada rather than sending it off to Saudi Arabia or Russia, a little bit to Norway, that's not so bad, I guess, would get rid of the tankers off the East Coast, which would be good because if there's no tankers, there's no chance of an oil spill, and would help save the right whale population. She was against all that. And oh, what do tankers burn? Diesel, I think. There's more CO2 emissions gone. At the end of the day, a pipeline is the single cheapest, most efficient, and safest way to ship oil. And as long as we need the oil, that's what we should be doing. Instead, she started saying, well, we should send it by rail. Well, railways tend to follow rivers and lakes. Now, an oil spill on land is ugly. An oil spill in our fresh water is even worse. But that was her solution. And what do railway trains run on again? Diesel. There's more CO2 emissions. This is the thing. We can generate the revenue. We can keep revenue in Canada. We can be better for the environment. We can do it all if we come at it open-minded and pragmatic, as opposed to, oh, I am in my little tribe and I'm going to stick exclusive and I'm going to shut you down and I'm going to cancel you if I disagree with you. And this is why, again, things like tonight are so great, because there's a chance to speak about and to hear about different ideas and how things are going to be done. And we've got the ideas. We will get the job done. You can see Trudeau trying to grab some of our housing stuff, and that's great. I'm glad that he's actually listening a little bit. I wish it was 8 years sooner, but better late than never.
So I'll again put this question out to both of you. I mean, assuming that affordability is going to be an issue, and assuming that that climate change poses a real risk to our future, which I have, as you've said, you're not here to debate against that. So, assuming that it does, what would you suggest are the alternatives? How do we address this challenge without a carbon tax?
I think we've already been chatting about a fair bit tonight. It's a matter of looking at open-minded, thinking about new ways, thinking about new ideas. Some of it's going to come from new technology. You know, carbon capture, for one, is going to help. How do we get rid of oil tankers coming in? Well, let's build that pipeline and get them done. Let's look at other avenues. Let's get our natural gas out to those other countries who desperately want it, so they stop building new coal plants. Do you really think India or China are going to shut down their brand new coal plant after 5 or 10 years? Because that's what the Paris Accord will require them to do if we're going to meet our targets. And I hope to God they're wrong with all their outlooks. Back in the 80s, when I was in elementary school, we were hearing about, oh, we're going to go into an ice age. In the 90s, I seem to remember this big hockey stick graft. In 2007, Al Gore fired off an inconvenient truth that we'd have no polar ice caps by 2015. Greta turned around and said, I think it was 2017, that we'd all be extinct by 2023. Well, it's 2024 now. Maybe she should have spent a little more time in school. But even a broken clock is right twice a day. I don't have all those answers. But here's the thing, what we're doing right now does no good for us, and it does no good for the world, which means everybody's losing. It's time for a different approach, and it's time for a new government. And I suspect, much in 20 years' time, people are going to look back and say, what were we thinking back in 2015 when we voted Trudeau in?
I think people will look back, future generations will look back and say, what were they thinking? They really, they didn't actually act when they could have acted. And they did stupid things like cutting carbon taxes, ending carbon taxes when they should have kept them and raised them. Because you raise carbon taxes on one hand, cut income taxes on the other, everybody gains. It's a simple solution. The idea of exporting natural gas as your way out of the climate emergency is just not going to work. It's like saying we're going to create a methane bomb and that'll solve the problem, because really the methane coming from those natural gas development is a disaster for the environment. The idea that building more pipelines, taking heavy crude from Alberta to the east is going to solve the climate crisis is really crazy. That's not going to work to cut carbon emissions. And so what the challenge for the Conservatives is, so we don't like the carbon tax. We don't like this 30% of all carbon emission reductions that are due to the carbon tax. They're going to have to fill that in for the next election. Otherwise, I think in Alberta, rural BC, Saskatchewan, the Conservatives will still vote for Poilievre. But in the rest of the country, people will say, you're not a credible party. You can Google Lisa Raitt. She's a Conservative MP who lost her seat in 2019. And she said she wouldn't have lost her seat in Ottawa. She lives in an urban riding, Eastern Ontario, if the Conservatives had had a carbon plan, a really good carbon reduction plan. And I think Poilievre is high in the polls now, and he might even get a majority next time. But I do think in the long run, as we see the wildfires sweeping across Canada, 90 wildfires burned through the winter in BC this winter, as our kids get the vote and start to say what's going to happen to us in the future. I think we're going to need real answers on what are you going to replace the carbon tax with. And pipelines to the east, exports to China are not going to reduce our carbon emissions. And it's going to be a problem for the Conservatives in the next election.
Just wait till you see his plan. It'll be there.
I'm going to look forward to it. Yeah.
So moving on from that, then, what about in the midterm, in 2025, in next year's election? You said what you describe as sort of populist politics, axe the tax, these slogans. You concede that it works, and you concede that Canadians are struggling with affordability right now. So assuming that Pierre Poilievre does whatever focus groups and research he's going to do and determines, yes, the carbon tax has to go, and even the NDP want to get rid of it, and it's a political winner. Supposing you're in that war room advising, or in that policy room, I suppose, advising Pierre Poilievre, and you're being asked, okay, well, we do want to do something for the environment. It's not going to be the carbon tax. What would you suggest? What would you say he should do?
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one, because making up sort of 30% of all climate or all carbon emissions reductions is a challenge. There are a couple of things. One is what Quebec is doing.
Actually, Dave, just where did you get that number 30? Because my number said 20 that I saw.
Environment Commissioner of Canada. He just did a report last year on it.
Because there's a report that came out just about a month ago, and it says the carbon tax, when fully implemented, will only account for 20%.
Just if you Google Environment Commissioner, carbon tax, and also carbon emission reductions, those three things, you'll get it. There's a report that he wrote last year on this. I was just reading it actually yesterday. But fair question, what could Poilievre do? Let's say he does get rid of this very good public policy tool. And one of the things that you could do, because it hides it from taxpayers, is do what Alberta's doing right now, which is really put a carbon tax on industrial emitters. They have a carbon tax that works very well politically. Nobody knows about it, right? They just increased it, like I said earlier, $15 a ton in April. Federal Liberals did it. Everybody knew, and give Poilievre credit. He's campaigning against Trudeau. But if we focus on the big industrial emitters, it becomes a hidden tax. Same with the Quebec system of carbon a cap on emissions, total cap, and a trading system, so that all the big emitters have to basically buy permission to pollute, and you pay your carbon tax that way. That's another, the European Union does that. The only problem with that one is then you require a huge bureaucracy. And I'm a fan of the conservative idea that we don't need to pay public service to do useless stuff. Carbon tax has many fewer public servants than Quebec and the European Union's cap and trade system. So it's going to be tough, I think, for Pierre Poilievre. The other idea is what's being negotiated now is to say we're going to get a lot of revenue from imports from India, China, and other high carbon producing companies, because we're going to tax them on that carbon. So that's another way of bringing in more money, which arguably means you can lower the carbon tax. But I do think the Conservatives had the best idea under O'Toole, which was to go along with what the economists say, what the World Bank says, what the CEOs of Husky and Suncor say, what the American Petroleum Institute says, which is the best way to do it is a carbon tax. Fewer bureaucrats, much fairer across the board, and you can cut income taxes for everybody.
I don't think Pierre needs advice from me on this issue a whole lot.
Or me.
And I would leave that to him. One thing I would point out, though, with regards to David's comment about with Alberta, hit the big emitters. Well, I'm against taxes in general. I'd like to see them all as low as absolutely possible. One advantage of that, though, over the carbon tax is that tax is just on the big emitters, so it's a one-stop. It doesn't hit everybody up all the way along. It's not going to hit the farmer and the trucker and everybody else. And you don't get GST, PST being charged each step of the way as well. So in that regard, I'd say if you had to choose something, that would be a much, much better way of doing it. That being said, still wouldn't be my number one choice, and I'll be waiting for Pierre to announce it on his platform rather than speculating what he's going to do.
Okay, well, after kind of going back and forth a bit, would you say, I'd just like to bring things together in a sense of where we agree, where we disagree on this. David, would you say that there's anything that David here has changed your mind on, or that you agree with him on, or that makes you think?
There's a couple pieces where I would agree with him on. If, and this is with a big if, you have to have a carbon tax. What BC did, God, that would be, 17 years ago? Where you have it revenue neutral, and you keep it very, very small. Just enough that you look at and it's like, I had to pay an extra, 25 cents or $1, something where it's not going to hurt, but you just see that line to get you thinking, hey, is there some way I can do better? I could live with that. But more to the point, though, instead of trying to tax our way out of this problem, let's actually look constructively, because the people that get hurt the most by taxes are those at the lower levels of the pay scale, because all of their money is going towards food and shelter, things you can't do without. Let's improve instead of trying to just tax our way out of the problem, say, hey, if we make it expensive enough, no one can afford it, and the problem will be solved. Well, let's try to have people be able to keep their quality of life. Let's encourage more investment into Canada, not less. As Harper kept cutting the corporate taxes and income taxes, the revenues went up. Why? Because we had more people employed. We had more companies coming here and investing their money in Canada. And with those extra revenues, we can put more money into healthcare, more money into social services, more money. Let's get a proper busing fleet going so it doesn't take me an hour to go less than 10 kilometers, and more people might be inclined to use it. That's the way we need to get, how we're going to fix this problem and get it done. But I would agree with what BC did originally was the right way to do it. And I think we can certainly both agree that Trudeau's just made a mess of just about everything he's touched.
I like your points about public transit. I think it is really problematic that some parts of our society pay a much higher price for the carbon tax. People in rural areas pay a much higher price because they don't have access to public transit, and that's a problem with the carbon tax. The way the feds have solved it is they have a 20% rural increased rebate for rural Canadians. But I think it's much more efficient just to say we'll cut rural Canadians' income taxes further. I think that investments in transportation make a lot of sense. But again, for people who hate taxes, where's the money going to come for that, right? And I would say a carbon tax is an excellent place to raise revenues. You can either offset income taxes or invest those monies in better public transit, encouraging people to buy electric vehicles, or, you know, most importantly is to conserve, is to cut the amount of energy we use. And it comes back to the conservatives. I love what you said about conservatives conserving. We should really be aiming to conserve much better than we do now, and everybody benefits that way. The planet benefits, and individual Canadian benefits from lower energy costs. So conservation, I think, is a really key issue. I hope conservatives in this room, and I have a feeling there are one or two here, will think about people like O'Toole and Mulroney and Reagan and Thatcher rather than Poilievre, because he's heading us in exactly the wrong direction, in my opinion.